Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are going to talk about a symbol. It's a logo that I guarantee you recognize, even if you're too young to have ever actually flown on the airline that used it.
Mm.
It's a blue globe, and it's overlaid with these clean, sort of swept-back white lines. It's affectionately known in the design world as the blue meatball.
The blue meatball. It is arguably one of the most recognized corporate logos of the entire 20th century. It's right up there with Coca-Cola, with Ford, the golden arches.
Absolutely. We are talking, of course, about Pan American World Airways,
Yeah.
Pan Am. And this isn't just a story about an airline. This is a story about an entity that, for a while, practically acted like its own nation state.
It really did.
Yeah.
It was the unofficial flag carrier of the United States. It completely defined luxury air travel. It ushered in the jet age.
It brought the Beatles to America. It was the airline James Bond flew. It was kind of the default airline in your head for global travel.
And yet, on a Wednesday in December 1991, it just stopped. It vanished.
That is the central paradox we need to unpack today.
Yeah.
Because usually when you have a company that has that level of cultural dominance, a near monopoly on the very idea of international travel, it takes a lot to kill it. But Pan Am died, and it died hard.
It was a truly spectacular collapse.
Yeah.
And what makes it so fascinating to study, especially with the stack of documents we have here, is that it wasn't just one thing. It wasn't just, bad management or a single bout of bad luck.
Right.
It was this perfect storm of regulatory shifts, massive geopolitical changes, and some incredibly bold, and you could say perhaps too bold, strategic gambles that just didn't pay off.
We have a massive amount of ground to cover. We've got historical records going all the way back to the 1920s. We have fleet manifest, bankruptcy filings, even personal accounts from the final days.
It's a huge story.
It is. But to understand how the blue meatball stopped spinning, we have to understand how it started spinning in the first place. And honestly, reading through this origin story, it reads less like a business biography and more like a Tom Clancy novel.
It really does. I think
Yeah.
most people assume Pan Am started because, some enterprising businessman saw a market for flying people to the Caribbean for tourism.
That's exactly what I assumed. Sun, sand, and maybe some rum cocktails.
But that was just the cover. The actual motivation for the founding of Pan Am was purely military. It was a geopolitical chess move orchestrated by the U.S. Army.
This is the part that just blew my mind in the research. We have to go back to 1927.
Yeah.
The world is obviously a very different place. Aviation is, well, it's in its infancy.
Purely.
And down in Colombia, very close to the Panama Canal, there is an airline called SCATA.
SCATA, which was actually the first airline in the Americas. But here's the problem for the United States. SCATA was Colombian on paper, but in reality, it was German-owned and German-operated.
And in the late 1920s, the U.S. military is looking at the Panama Canal, which is, it's basically the most strategic waterway in the world for the U.S. Navy.
Absolutely critical.
And they see German pilots flying German planes just a few hundred miles away, and they are not happy about it.
Exactly. The War Department started getting very, very nervous. They received intelligence that SCATA was actively lobbying for landing rights in the Panama Canal Zone itself. The official reason was they wanted to survey routes for passenger connections up to the U.S.
Sure, passenger connections.
But two U.S. Army officers, Major Hap Arnold and Major Carl Spaatz, names you'll recognize from World War II, they looked at this and said, absolutely not.
They viewed it as a precursor to a threat. It's obvious. If you have German planes surveying the canal, you have German bombers within range of the canal.
Precisely. So Arnold and Spaatz realized they couldn't just ban SCATA.
Yeah.
That would cause a huge diplomatic incident with Colombia. They needed to beat them at their own game.
So they needed an American alternative?
They needed an American commercial carrier to dominate the region so there would be no excuse, no reason for SCATA to expand northward. They needed a chosen instrument.
There's that phrase, the chosen instrument. It appears all over these early documents. It sounds almost religious or like something from a sci-fi movie. But in this context, it's a specific policy doctrine, isn't it?
It is, yeah. The chosen instrument was this idea that international aviation was just too expensive, too risky, and way too politically sensitive for open competition. The government believed that to project American power abroad, they should support a single private monopoly.
So they would pick one winner.
They'd pick one winner and then protect it from all other American competitors. They'd clear the field for them.
So enter Juan Trippe.
Enter Juan Trippe. He is the sort of protagonist of our story. He was young, he was wealthy, and he was incredibly connected. He founded a company called the Aviation Corporation of the Americas in June 1927. You just have to look at his backers. Cornelius Vanderbilt, Whitney, W. Averell Harriman.
These are not just investors. These are like American royalty. This is the establishment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This was old money and immense political influence. But here's the funny thing. Trippe had all the connections, but he didn't have the landing rights in Havana, Cuba. There were actually 3 different American groups fighting for this one crucial mail contract.
Right. The U.S. Post Office put out a bid for mail delivery from Key West to Havana, and this was the mechanism to block the Germans. Win that mail contract, establish the route, and you lock them out.
But it was a complete mess. One group had the planes, another group had the landing rights, and Trippe had the political backing. And the Army basically grabbed all 3 of them by the collars and said, merge, now.
A shotgun wedding.
Total shotgun wedding.
Mm-hmm.
They realized that if these Americans kept infighting, the Germans would win by default.
So in 1927, Pan American Airways is born, and they cut it so close. I love the detail in the records about the very first flight. They had a deadline to move the mail by October 19th, 1927, or they would lose the contract entirely.
And they didn't have a plane ready. Theirs was literally stuck in the mud in New Jersey. They had to charter a Fairchild float plane from a tiny Dominican carrier at the very last minute. The pilot, Cy Caldwell, literally flew the mail bag to Havana, landed, and saved the contract with hours to spare.
They didn't even own the aircraft for their own inaugural flight.
Not at all. Talk about fake it till you make it.
Wow. But once they secured that contract, the chosen instrument policy really kicks in. And this is where the growth becomes just explosive. Because the government effectively insulated Pan Am from any domestic competition.
Right. If you were a domestic airline back then, like United or TWA, and you wanted to fly to South America, the government would just say, sorry, that's Pan Am's turf.
So Trippe used this protection to build an empire.
He went on a buying spree.
Mm-hmm.
He bought up all these struggling little airlines in Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean. He was basically playing a real-life game of Risk.
And he was partnering up, too.
He was. He partnered with shipping companies, like the Great Shipping Line, to form Pinagra. He was painting the map blue, one country at a time. And he was doing it with a real flair for marketing.
This brings us to the famous tour he took with Charles Lindbergh in 1929.
Lindbergh was, he was the most famous man on the planet at that point, after his solo Atlantic flight.
Absolutely. Having him on board was a massive coup.
It was a masterstroke. He was a technical advisor for Pan Am. So Trippe and Lindbergh flew all around Latin America together, negotiating landing rights directly with presidents and heads of state. They were essentially conducting U.S. foreign policy from the cockpit of a Sikorsky amphibian.
And they just squeezed the German interests out route by route.
Squeezed them right out.
So by the mid-1930s, Pan Am basically owns Latin America. But the real legend of Pan Am, the imagery that we all have in our heads, that comes from the next phase, the conquest of the oceans, the Clipper era.
Ah, the Clippers. This is where the branding genius of Juan Trippe really, really shines. You have to remember, in the 1930s, flying was still seen as incredibly dangerous, loud, and uncomfortable.
Right. The pilots were still seen as barnstormers.
Exactly. They wore leather jackets, oil-stained scarves, and goggles. It was a daredevil profession, not a luxury one.
And Trippe wanted to change that perception completely.
He wanted to compete with the ocean liners, the grand ships like the Queen Mary or the Normandy. So he borrowed their language. He started calling his planes clippers, after the great 19th century sailing ships.
He called the pilots captains and the co-pilots first officers.
Pure maritime terminology. And the uniforms, this is a detail I love. He got rid of the leather jackets and put his crews in naval-style double-breasted jackets and these pristine white officer caps.
It was pure theater.
It was, but it had a very specific psychological purpose. When you see a pilot step out of a plane in a naval uniform, you don't think daredevil. You think authority, stability, maritime competence. It was designed to calm the passengers' nerves.
And the planes themselves were just massive, these flying boats. The Boeing 314.
The 314 was a palace. It wasn't a plane, it was a flying hotel. It had full dining rooms with white linen tablecloths and real silverware. It had sleeping berths that converted from the seats. It had separate dressing rooms for men and women.
It was the absolute height of luxury. But while the passengers are, enjoying 5-course meals, the logistics required to keep those planes in the air were, they were absolutely insane.
Especially across the Pacific.
Right. This brings us to the Pacific. And I think this is the most underappreciated part of the Pan Am story. We look back now and think, oh, they flew to China. But if you look at a map in 1935, flying from San Francisco to Manila seems, well, It seems physically impossible.
It was considered impossible by almost everyone. The range of the aircraft at the time, the Martin M130, was about 2,400 miles, comfortably. But the Pacific is just vast. You can't just fly straight across. You need stepping stones.
But there are no stepping stones out there. It's just ocean.
Well, there are dots on the map. Tiny, uninhabited coral atolls. Midway, Wake Island, Guam. Trippe looked at the map and said, "We'll use those."
But Wake Island wasn't a place you could just land a plane. It was a coral reef with some birds on it. There was nothing there.
Exactly. There was no fresh water, no food, no electricity, and certainly no hotel for the passengers. So before Pan Am could fly a single passenger across the Pacific, they had to launch a full-blown colonization expedition.
The SS North Haven.
The SS North Haven. In 1935, they chartered this 15,000-ton merchant ship, and they loaded it with everything you could possibly imagine. Lumber, diesel generators, refrigerators, radios, canned food, furniture.
They even brought soil, didn't they?
They brought tons of topsoil so they could plant gardens for fresh vegetables. They brought prefab hotel sections. They literally sailed to these desolate rocks in the middle of the Pacific and built fully functioning villages from scratch.
And they had to clear the lagoons.
Right, because these were flying boats. They landed on the water. But the lagoons were filled with coral heads, these sharp rock formations just below the surface that would rip the hull of the plane open.
So they sent divers down.
They sent divers down with dynamite. They had to blast runways into the coral reefs. It was an underwater construction project.
All of this just to refuel the plane.
Just to refuel the plane and let the passengers sleep for the night because they didn't fly at night. So you'd fly for 10 or 12 hours, land in this beautiful lagoon at Wake Island, take a launch to a hotel that Pan Am built from nothing, have a steak dinner that was flown in from San Francisco, sleep in a Pan Am bed, and then get back on the plane the next morning.
That is the definition of full service. And the result of all of this was the China Clipper.
November 1935. The first scheduled airmail flight across the Pacific. It cut the travel time from San Francisco to Manila from 3 weeks on a steamship down to 6 days.
It was a miracle.
It made the world effectively 70% smaller overnight. It was a monumental achievement.
And shortly after that, they conquered the Atlantic with the Yankee Clipper in 1939, which was the first transatlantic passenger flight.
New York to Southampton via a few stops in Canada and Ireland. Another incredible feat. But looking at the dates, 1939, the party was about to end.
World War II.
World War II. And this is where the chosen instrument policy really paid off for the U.S. government. When the war started, the military didn't have a global air transport network. Pan Am was the network.
So they pivoted instantly from luxury travel to military transport.
They did. Pan Am flew over 90 million miles for the military during the war. They ferried generals, they ferried critical supplies, they even flew components for the Manhattan Project. Franklin Roosevelt became the first sitting U.S. president to fly abroad, and he did it on a Pan Am Clipper, the Dixie Clipper, to meet Churchill in Casablanca.
So 1945 comes around, the war ends, the Allies win. Pan Am has served its country with distinction. Juan Trippe probably thought, okay, now we really cash in, now we rule the world.
He certainly expected that. He pushed hard for the government to formalize his monopoly. He wanted Pan Am to be the officially designated flag carrier of the United States, enshrined in law forever.
But the political winds had shifted completely.
Drastically.
Sure.
The Roosevelt and Truman administrations were looking at the post-war world, and they decided that monopolies were fundamentally un-American. They wanted competition. They believed competition would lower prices and spur innovation.
So instead of giving Trippe the crown he wanted,
they started handing out international route authorities to his competitors. Suddenly, TWA was allowed to fly across the Atlantic to Europe. United Northwest Airlines were allowed to fly to Hawaii and into Asia.
That must have been a profound shock to Trippe.
It was seen as a betrayal in Trippe's eyes. The chosen instrument was dead. The era of protection was over.
So how does he respond? He doesn't seem like the kind of guy who just shrinks and accepts a smaller market share.
Not at all. His new strategy was, if he couldn't have a monopoly on routes, he decided he would have a monopoly on technology. He would simply fly faster, bigger, and more advanced aircraft than anyone else. He decided Pan Am would single-handedly usher in the jet age.
And this brings us right to the Boeing 707.
Pan Am was the launch customer. October 1958, Pan Am inaugurates daily jet service from New York to Paris. And again, you have to put this in context. Before the jet, that flight took 12 to 14 hours, rattling around in a noisy piston engine plane.
With at least one refueling stop.
Right. The 707 did it nonstop in 7 hours. It was smooth, it was quiet, you were flying above the weather. It was revolutionary.
It changed the geography of the world again. Europe was suddenly a long weekend trip from New York.
But Trippe didn't stop there. He did something that I think defines the modern world of travel more than anything else. He commissioned the jumbo jet, the Boeing 747.
This is the biggest gamble in the history of commercial aviation.
Without a doubt. By the mid-60s, air travel was growing like crazy. Airports were getting crowded. Trippe went to Boeing and said, I need a plane that is 2.5 times the size of the 707.
And Boeing was hesitant, right? They thought the future was supersonic. They were focused on building an SST to compete with the Concorde.
Everyone thought supersonic was the future. The 747 was actually seen as a bit of a stopgap. Boeing designed it thinking it would mostly be a cargo plane in the long run. That's why it has that distinctive hump, so the nose could swing up to load freight.
But Trippe forced their hand.
He forced their hand. He placed a massive $525 million order in 1966. That is billions and billions in today's money. He bet the entire company on this single idea that air travel would become a mass-market commodity.
And that's a key distinction. The Clipper era was for the elite, the super wealthy. The 747 was for everyone.
It was the democratization of global travel. Pan Am had already introduced tourist class, what we now call economy class, on their DC-6Bs years earlier. But the 747 was the first plane built for it. 400 people on a single aircraft. It was unheard of.
Before we get to how that massive gamble paid off, or spoiler alert, didn't, we have to talk about the cultural peak of Pan Am in the 1960s. Because it wasn't just about the planes, it was the whole vibe.
It was the world's most experienced airline?
Yeah.
That was their slogan, and they backed it up. They were everywhere. They even built their own hotel chain, the Intercontinental Hotels.
Why did they do that?
Because Trippe realized that in some of these new exotic destinations they were flying to, there weren't any hotels up to American standards. So he just built them himself. It was vertical integration on a global scale.
And the architecture. The Pan Am building in New York, right on top of Grand Central Terminal, it completely blocked the view down Park Avenue. It was this massive, brutalist statement. It just screamed dominance.
And the World Port at JFK, that terminal looked like a flying saucer had landed. It had that incredible elliptical roof that hung out over the airplane so passengers wouldn't get wet when they boarded. It was pure space-age optimism.
Speaking of the space age, we can't ignore the pop culture. It was everywhere. When the Beatles came to America in '64, they stepped off a Pan Am jet, the Clipper Defiance.
When James Bond flies to Jamaica in Dr. No, he flies Pan Am. He flies it again in Live and Let Die.
And then there's Stanley Kubrick's 2001, A Space Odyssey.
The Clipper. The Orion III. Kubrick and his writer Arthur C. Clarke worked directly with Pan Am designers to imagine what a commercial spaceplane would look like in the year 2001. And it had the blue meatball on the tail. It just felt inevitable.
It felt so inevitable that Pan Am actually started a waiting list for flights to the moon.
The first Moon Flights Club. It's incredible. It started as a bit of a joke. A journalist from Vienna called and asked to make a reservation, but Pan Am just leaned into it completely. They printed up and issued membership cards.
And how many people signed up?
Over 93,000 people signed up. They were telling people, expect departure around the year 2000.
Yeah.
There's even a psychological term, the Pan Am smile, for a fake perfunctory smile that came from their TV commercials.
That optimism is it's heartbreaking in retrospect. Because while they were dreaming of the moon in the late 60s, the seeds of their destruction were already being planted right here on Earth.
The descent begins almost at the exact moment the 747 enters service. It's a classic case of just terrible, terrible timing.
So 1970, the 747 starts flying. It's huge, it's beautiful, but it has a lot of seats to fill.
A lot of seats. And then 1973 hits. The OPEC oil prices.
The embargo, they turn off the tap.
Fuel prices don't just go up, they quadruple almost overnight.
Yeah.
And at the exact same time, the global economy goes into a deep recession. So suddenly, Pan Am has this brand new fleet of massive planes that gulp fuel like crazy.
And people stop traveling because they can't afford it.
Exactly. So they are flying these gigantic half-empty 747s across the Atlantic. They were flying aluminum balloons. And this exposed the fundamental fatal flaw in Pan Am's corporate structure. We need to talk about the domestic hull.
This is the technical part that I really want to understand. Because to the layman, Pan Am looked huge. They flew everywhere. Why did not having domestic routes end up killing them?
Okay, think of an airline network like a funnel. To fill a massive 400-seat 747 flying from New York to London, You need to gather people from all over the United States. You need someone coming from Cleveland, someone from St. Louis, someone from Nashville, all flying into JFK to get on that one big plane
Right. You need feeder
in
traffic.
the feeder traffic. But Pan Am didn't have those flights. Because of the old regulations, they were only allowed to fly internationally, with a few exceptions like Hawaii and Alaska.
Yeah.
So if you lived in St. Louis and wanted to fly Pan Am to London, you first had to buy a ticket on TWA or United to get you to New York.
You had to change airlines?
You had to change airlines, probably change terminals, recheck your bags. It was a huge hassle. But for a long time, it worked because Pan Am was the main and sometimes only option across the ocean.
But then came 1978, deregulation.
The Airline Deregulation Act.
Mm-hmm.
President Carter signs it into law, and the gloves come off.
The government basically just removed all the restrictions on where airlines could fly.
That's right. Suddenly, domestic airlines like United, American, and Delta were allowed to start flying internationally.
And they had the funnel.
They had the funnel. United could now fly you from St. Louis to New York on a United plane, and then you just walk down the hall and get on a United flight to London. They could price the whole ticket cheaper. They could keep your bags in their system. They controlled the passenger from their doorstep all the way to the destination.
And Pan Am was left stranded at the international gateway at JFK or Miami, just waiting for passengers that weren't showing up anymore.
Their feed traffic just dried up. Their competitors were eating their lunch. Pan Am was an airline without a country. It had no domestic base to support its massive international ambitions.
So they tried to fix it. I mean, they knew this was a problem, and their solution was the merger with National Airlines in 1980.
And this is often cited as one of the worst, if not the worst, merger in corporate history.
So what was the logic?
Pan Am bought National Airlines specifically to get their domestic route network. On paper, it makes perfect sense. You need domestic routes, you go out and buy a domestic airline.
But the execution was a catastrophe.
A total catastrophe. First, they massively overpaid. There was a bidding war with Frank Lorenzo at Texas Air, and Pan Am panicked and ended up paying $437 million, far more than it was worth. They panic bought it.
And the famous culture clash?
Oil and water. Pan Am was. It was aristocratic. Their pilots saw themselves as the gods of the sky. They flew 747s to Tokyo and Paris. National Airlines was a scrappy, no-frills, mostly regional carrier based in Florida. They flew shorter hops, mainly up and down the East Coast.
I can just imagine the friction in the crew rooms.
It was toxic, and the labor costs just exploded. To get the different unions to agree to the merger, Pan Am basically had to agree to bump everyone's pay up to the highest level across both companies. So suddenly, they were paying National Airlines staff these premium Pan Am wages. The costs went right through the roof, but the revenue didn't follow.
And National didn't even have the right routes, did it?
No. That was the other killer. National flew mostly north-south along the East Coast. New York to Miami was their big route. Pan Am needed east-west traffic from the Midwest to feed its Atlantic hub at JFK, and it needed a West Coast presence to feed what was left of its Pacific routes. It was a complete strategic mismatch.
So they are bleeding money. The 747s are still half empty. The merger is a bust. And now begins the really sad phase of the story, selling the silverware.
To stay alive, they started liquidating their most valuable assets. And they had some great assets. They sold the Pan Am building in New York to MetLife for $400 million.
That iconic building in the middle of Manhattan, just gone.
They sold the Intercontinental Hotel chain they had built from scratch. But the one that really signaled the end, the one that made everyone in the aviation world just gasp, was in 1985. They sold the entire Pacific division to United Airlines.
The Pacific, the ocean they pioneered, the legacy of the China Clipper and the SS North Haven, they sold it.
Lock, stock, and barrel. They sold the routes, the invaluable landing rights in Tokyo, and the planes, including their fleet of specialized long-range 747 SPs. United paid $750 million for it.
It sounds like a lot of money at the time.
It was a desperate cash injection to stop the bleeding. But strategically, it was suicide. They cut off one of their two main arteries. They effectively became an Atlantic-only airline. And by handing the entire Pacific network to United, they created a mega competitor that would eventually help crush them.
So they are limping along. They are a shadow of their former glorious selves, but they are still flying. And then tragedy strikes.
December 21st, 1988.
Lockerbie.
Flight 103. A Boeing 747, the Clipper made of the seas, was destroyed by a terrorist bomb over Lockerbie, Scotland. All 259 people on board and 11 people on the ground were killed.
We all remember the human tragedy, which was just horrific. But from a cold business perspective, what did this do to the airline?
It destroyed the brand's most valuable asset, trust. Pan Am had always always marketed itself as the world's most experienced airline. That implied safety. It implied security. After Lockerbie, passengers were terrified to fly Pan Am.
And it wasn't just the fear of terrorism, it was the revelation that Pan Am's own security had been lax.
The FAA fined them for serious security failures. The families of the victims filed a lawsuit for over $300 million. Major corporate accounts canceled their travel contracts overnight. It was a death blow to their reputation. The trust was gone.
And yet they staggered on for another 2 years. But history had one more punch left to throw.
The Gulf War. August 1990. Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait.
It's the 1973 oil crisis all over again.
Exactly. Fuel prices spike.
Yeah.
Fear of terrorism in international travel skyrockets. Transatlantic travel dropped by more than 50% in a matter of months. Pan Am had absolutely no cash reserves left to weather that kind of storm.
So they started selling everything that wasn't nailed down.
Everything. They sold their routes to London Heathrow, the crown jewel of transatlantic travel to United. Once they sold Heathrow, they were barely a major international airline anymore. They sold their German routes, the IGS to Lufthansa.
Oh, wait, we skipped over the IGS. We have to mention this because it's such a cool historical quirk. The internal German services?
Yes, sorry, we can't leave that out. It's fascinating. For most of the Cold War, Pan Am was basically the domestic airline of West Germany.
Because German airlines, like Lufthansa, couldn't fly into West Berlin, right?
Correct. Under the post-World War II occupation rules, only Allied nation planes, so US, UK, and French, could fly through the air corridors into West Berlin. So Pan Am operated a massive and very profitable shuttle network connecting West Berlin to cities like Frankfurt, Hamburg, and Munich.
And these weren't normal flights. They were flying over East German territory.
No, they were flying through these three very narrow air corridors. It was tightly controlled airspace. If you deviated from the path, Soviet MiG fighters would intercept you. Pan Am pilots flew these routes at low altitude, sometimes under visual flight rules. It was high-stress, high-frequency flying.
And very profitable.
It was a cash cow for decades. And Pan Am employed local German flight attendants. It was this really unique subculture within the airline. But in 1990, with the Berlin Wall down and the company dying, they sold that whole operation too, to Lufthansa.
So we get to January 1991, Pan Am files for bankruptcy, but they keep flying.
They're in Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection.
Right.
And Delta Airlines steps in. They provide funding. It's called debtor-in-possession financing to keep Pan Am operating while they negotiate to buy the remaining good assets.
And there was a plan for a new Pan Am, right? A smaller, leaner version.
The idea was to shrink Pan Am down to just a Miami-based carrier serving Latin America and the Caribbean. Sort of bring it back to its roots. Delta would buy most of the European routes and the Pan Am shuttle, and in return, they'd own 45% of this new, smaller Pan Am.
But the numbers just didn't work.
They're losing $3 million a day. The advanced bookings for the holiday season were terrible, and on December 3rd, 1991, Delta's board of directors looked at the spreadsheet and just said, no more, we're not putting another dollar in.
They pulled the plug.
December 4th. The call goes out from the headquarters in the Pan Am building in New York. Shut it down.
And it was immediate.
Immediate.
Yeah.
7,500 employees lost their jobs instantly. There are these heartbreaking stories from that day of pilots taxiing their planes out to the runway, getting the call from the control tower, and having to turn the plane around, go back to the gate, and tell the passengers to get off because the airline no longer exists.
What about the final flight?
The final flight was Clipper Goodwill, Pan Am Flight 436. It was already in the air, flying from Barbados to Miami. It landed in Miami late that afternoon. The airport fire trucks gave it a water cannon salute as it taxied to the gate. The captain shut down the engines, and that was it. The blue meatball stopped spinning.
It's such a definitive sudden end, but it didn't stay dead. Not entirely. This is the afterlife section of our deep dive, and frankly, it gets a little weird.
It gets very weird. The brand itself was just too powerful, too iconic to disappear completely into the history books. It became what you call a zombie brand.
It's been resurrected, what, 5 or 6 times now?
At least.
Hmm.
In the late 90s, a group of investors bought the rights and started a low-cost carrier called Pan Am 2. It failed pretty quickly. Then there was Pan Am 3rd, which was a tiny regional airline based in New Hampshire.
And the railway, this is the strangest one. I was driving in New England a few years ago, and I saw a boxcar on a freight train with the Pan Am logo on it. I honestly thought I was hallucinating.
No, you saw it right. A company called Guilford Transportation Industries bought the brand and renamed their entire railroad Pan Am Railways. So for about 20 years, Pan Am was a train company that mostly hauled lumber and paper pulp.
That is just bizarre. It feels Wrong.
It is. And today, it's mostly a licensing play. You can buy Pan Am branded luggage, Pan Am watches. There's a flagship Pan Am apparel store in Seoul, South Korea, of all places.
And the notes mention a potential comeback in 2025. Is that serious?
Well, a group called Pan Am Global Holdings now owns the name. They recently ran a one-off commemorative charter flight across the Atlantic using a Boeing 757. They claim they want to restart scheduled service.
I feel like at this point it's just nostalgia farming. It can never be the same.
It can't. You can't recreate the original Pan Am because the world that created it, the world of the chosen instrument, of government-backed monopolies, of pioneering new technologies, that world doesn't exist anymore.
That's the key takeaway, isn't it? Pan Am was a creature of its time.
It was. It was a brilliant engineering company and a powerful political entity that tried and failed to survive in a ruthless, deregulated marketplace. It failed as a business, but it absolutely succeeded as a pioneer.
They invented the concept of economy class. They invented the idea of an airline having its own hotel chain. They pushed Boeing to build the 747, the plane that made global travel affordable for millions.
They made the world smaller. That's the ultimate legacy. Before Pan Am, the oceans were barriers. After Pan Am, they were just time zones you crossed.
I want to leave our listeners with a thought that really struck me while reading about the Moon Club. Pan Am was taking reservations for commercial lunar flights in the 1960s. They saw themselves as the company that would take humanity to the stars.
And today,
Today, we have private companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin pushing that frontier. And I just wonder, is the spirit of Pan Am truly dead, or has it just moved? Are Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos the new Juan Trippes?
it's a very valid comparison. You have massive egos, massive political connections, and a willingness to burn billions and billions of dollars to do something that seems impossible.
It's something to chew on next time you look up at the night sky. Or maybe the next time you're squeezed into an economy class seat on a flight that costs less than a good pair of shoes. You can thank Pan Am for both the ability to go and maybe for the lack of legroom.
A fair trade, I suppose, in the end.
Thanks for diving deep with us today on the incredible life and death of the Blue Meatball.
Safe travels.